LSD basically makes the brain much more connected. Parts of the brain which haven't been allowed to talk to each other for 30, 40 years can talk to each other again. And so we've opened up, I think, the scientific study of things like creativity.
This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs.
Remember these commercials?
Any questions?
What does the brain look like on drugs? That's a question scientists have just now started to answer. David Nutt used to be one of the English government's top drug advisors. That is, until he started raising some uncomfortable questions and lost the job. Now he researches psychedelics at Imperial College London, and he co-authored the first brain imaging study involving LSD. We sat down with him at the Psychedelic Science Conference in Oakland, California, where he was presenting some of his findings to talk about his research, the future of psychedelic science, and how he got fired from his government job for saying the wrong things about drugs.
For 9 years, I was the head of the group that assessed drug harms for the government. And over that time, we did an enormous amount of research into the comparative harms of drugs. And as a result of that, I discovered, somewhat to my surprise, that alcohol was actually the most harmful drug in the UK. And that the drugs that politicians like to get hysterical about, like cannabis and MDMA, ecstasy, were comparably much less harmful. So then I started explaining that to the government, saying, well, our drug laws are wrong. You're actually putting people in prison for cannabis possession is not fair because alcohol is more dangerous. And they did not want to hear that. And they said, stop saying that.
I mean, isn't that your job as the drug advisor for the government?
Well, I thought it was my job. Yeah, I thought my job was to evaluate evidence and make recommendations. But they said, no, he's doing more than that. He's trying to change government policy. And I said, well, I thought that's what all scientists did. If the evidence suggests the policy's wrong, we want to change the policy. But you can't, once you've been sacked, you've got no comeback. Well, of course, what did happen was that it put the whole issue of drug harms and comparative harms in the public domain. And there was an enormous outcry, and a lot of scientists wrote petitions saying they should reinstate me. And I became famous. And the whole drug debate went viral. And so for the first time, we actually had a proper debate. So the government shot itself in the head, really, because it went from drugs being something you didn't talk about to drugs being something everyone wanted to talk about.
The UK's chief drugs advisor, Professor David Nutt, has been sacked by the Home Secretary, Alan Johnson.
Has the Home Secretary scored an own goal, do you think, tonight, Professor Nutt, by sacking you in this way and giving you the oxygen of the publicity that we're now giving you?
It's a bad day for science that government scientists, government advisors cannot share their genuine concerns about the misrepresentation of science in legislation.
Why was that such a taboo thing to say?
There are some things which are just, you can't have what you might call a balanced debate because everyone has a strong view. And drugs are bad, everyone. Drugs are bad, war on drugs, we've got to get rid of drugs. And that was our policy, the same way it's been American policy. So anyone challenging that was actually really cutting to the heart of this sort of the prejudices which underpin the British establishment. And it went right through government. It went certainly through both the right-wing and the left-wing parties.
It's my understanding that the U.S. drug policy really drives a lot of policy in other countries. Could you speak to that as someone involved in the European drug policy?
U.S. policy on drugs was basically rolled out across the world through the United Nations. The US said jump, we said how high, sir. Every single drug policy in Britain was driven to comply with American policy. And I know that. I know that there were drugs which were not controlled in Britain, like cat. And I know that the US government pushed our government to eventually get cat banned. I managed to hold that back, actually, until I was sacked. We didn't make it illegal, but eventually they gave in.
And you're first and foremost a drug researcher,
yes.
And you just completed some very interesting research in conjunction with the Beckley Foundation. It was a brain imaging study. Could you tell me how that study was structured?
So LSD, a fascinating drug. In the 1950s and 60s, it was going to solve the world's problems. The National Institute of Health in America funded 140 separate studies on LSD.
We give them a small dose of LSD.
It was the revolutionary drug. And then as soon as it started being used recreationally, it suddenly became the evil drug and it got banned. And since then, there's never been a single study of LSD in America. And there's never been an imaging study of LSD. Now, as a scientist, as a psychiatrist, a drug that has such profound opportunities to change the way, for instance, people are addicted, seemed to me we must study it. So having done studies with a sort of simpler, a less threatening psychedelic, psilocybin mushroom juice, we decided it was time to bite the bullet and do the first brain imaging study of LSD. We saw effects which were somewhat similar to what we'd seen with psilocybin, but more profound, as you might expect, because LSD has a very profound effect on many aspects of brain function. And the key messages are that LSD breaks down the normal structure of brain integration. Our brains are trained over decades to do things exactly the same way as everyone else, and exactly the same way every day, every hour, every minute, every second. And those structures we thought were hardwired, but it turns out they're not hardwired. They can be disrupted by LSD. And LSD basically makes the brain much more connected. Parts of the brain which haven't been allowed to talk to each other for 30, 40 years can talk to each other again. Huge amount of crosstalk. So we call this the entropic brain, or the much more flexible brain. And we think that's what underlies the experiences that people have during the trip. We've got good evidence for that. But also explains why afterwards people often feel different and better, because they've been allowed to, actually the brain's been allowed to work in a slightly different way for the first time perhaps ever.
When people were closing their eyes, the part of the brain that's associated with vision was actually still active. Could you tell me what you take away from that?
Yeah, so what we showed was that this so-called, the complex visual hallucinations that people see.
Everything turns into vibrations. It's like everything is falling apart, and I can see all the atoms in everything.
Under psychedelics, they close their eyes, and they say, it's like films going on in front of their eyes, even though their eyes are closed. And we discovered why that is. It's because normally I close my eyes and there's very little activity in my visual cortex, and there's no activity linking the visual cortex to the rest of my brain. But under LSD, the visual cortex was connected to every part of the brain. There was crosstalk. And of course, crosstalk with the visual system is visual talk. So that's why you have these fascinating, complex, interesting images.
If one of the big takeaways from this is that on LSD, the brain, different parts of the brain that don't usually work together are suddenly somehow connected. What does that mean? Where does that take us? What questions should we now be asking that we have that information?
Well, I think what's fascinating about it is it doesn't just explain the psychedelic state, but it also helps us make sense of why drugs like LSD can change the way people behave in the long term. There were 6 trials in America for LSD to be used to treat alcoholism. In fact, the founder of AA, Bill Wilson, he got his liberation from his alcoholism. The chains that held him to his drink were broken by a psychedelic experience. He became a profound enthusiast for LSD, and he pioneered these 6 trials of using LSD for alcoholism. It works. People are much less likely to relapse back to drinking after they've had a psychedelic experience, because they can see there's a world out there which isn't all about the bottle.
How difficult or easy was it to study this in the first place?
Well, it wasn't easy, but because it was an experiment on normal volunteers, it was a lot easier than doing it in patients. So the big challenge then is to go from these interesting studies in normal volunteers and take them into patients. That becomes a lot more complicated, because an experiment is controlled by a different kind of ethics than a medicine.
At this conference, we've heard researchers talk about some potentially promising results using psychedelics to treat things like PTSD, depression, anxiety. Do the brain scans that you did offer any clue as to why psychedelics seem to offer some relief to these kind of conditions?
Psychiatric disorders, say like depression or PTSD, exist because people cannot disengage. They get locked into a form of thinking. Depressed people keep thinking negative thoughts. I made a mistake, I was a bad mother. I made a mistake, I was a bad person. They can't disengage those thoughts. PTSD, people can't disengage from the memory. And over time, those circuits in the brain become completely self-determining. They just go on and on and on, even if the person wants to stop them. And they can't. And I think the disruption of circuits, the breaking down of these regimented silos of function of the brain by psychedelics is one explanation as to why people can escape from those underlying disorders.
Some critics might think, why study psychedelics at all? We have pharmaceuticals that treat anxiety, depression, that are specifically designed to help with these disorders. Why open this can of worms and study psychedelics at all?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And the people who are against psychedelics often say that. We don't need it. Well, we've got good treatments. Well, the truth is, we don't have very good treatments. Half of all people who are treated with antidepressants don't respond to the first dose. To get 90% responding, you've got to usually have 2 or 3 trials. So there are people that don't respond, who never respond. So there's an opportunity for them. Disorders like alcoholism, response rates are like 10%, not 80%. So there's a huge unmet need. That's the first thing. Second thing is, these are fundamental states of altered consciousness. I would argue the greatest goal for science is understanding the human brain. You can't understand the human brain if you don't understand how the human brain is different when it's on a psychedelic. To me, this is one of the most fundamental questions of understanding the brain.
Do you think that psychedelics could offer a scientific glimpse into the phenomenon of consciousness itself?
The conclusion I've come to from our work is that there are at least 2 forms of consciousness. There's a consciousness which most people talk about when they talk about consciousness, which is whether you're awake or asleep, whether you actually know what you're doing, whether you can remember what you're saying, whether you've got self-awareness. That's one consciousness. And we know what drives that. That's driven by neurotransmitters called glutamate and GABA. But there's another form of consciousness, and this is what psychedelics change the nature of consciousness, not the amount of it, but the content. It's a completely different axis of brain function, and that's driven by serotonin, or the serotonin receptors that psychedelics work on. And that is fascinating to me. And I think that axis is actually an axis that scientists don't know about, because that's not the scientific axis. That's the axis that artists, creative people work on. Poets, painters use it. It's, scientists think very linearly, but this is a non-linear kind of experiential thinking. And so we've opened up, I think, the scientific study of things like creativity.
And as you mentioned before, back in the 50s and 60s, these were questions that started to be explored, and then there was this long period that coincided with the war on drugs where it just was not explored. And now people are starting to pick these questions back up again and start asking them again. This conference we're attending right now has been around since 2010, and back then there were only a few scientists actually running studies. You were one of them. Now it seems like it's spread. There's more people, the studies are getting bigger and bigger. Could you give us just a lay of the land? Where is psychedelic science at this moment?
It's entering the mainstream.
Okay.
So it's like going to college. It's just, it's a freshman. Okay. It's just getting there in the first term. People are seeing it and saying, well, it's not killing people. It's actually given us interesting insights into the brain. It may be offering new treatments. The next stage is getting what you might call the mainstream scientists to say, we can progress our science more if we use these drugs. So that's going to be the next big hike. And maybe in 4 years' time, we'll see another big expansion. I mean, the science here, compared with 4 years ago, it's 5 times more. And maybe in 5 years' time, it'll be 25 times more.
Are there any policy changes, either here in the United States or in Europe, that would enable this to proceed even more quickly?
Oh, yes. I mean, it's still very difficult. These drugs are all stuck in what's called Schedule 1 under the UN conventions, under the USA law. We've got to get them out of Schedule 1. We've got to put them in Schedule 2 or any other schedule which allows scientists to work with them without being treated as if they're criminals.
And how would you envision these types of drugs being integrated into society or the medical establishment?
These are the drugs which bring together psychiatry and psychology. These drugs are not drugs you take every day to hold at bay your depression or your anxiety. These are drugs which you use with a psychotherapist to change the way you deal with life. And that way you get mastery over your anxiety or depression. So I see these drugs as being enormously powerful ways of bringing psychotherapy and medicine together. And that, I think, is going to be a huge element of psychotherapy in the future. It's going to be drug-assisted psychotherapy. It's going to be the great advance in the next 20 years.